Thanks for checking out this episode of the Rookie Big Board. If you enjoy the video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe, and you can check out all of my work, patreon.com/theFFEducator. This is episode 23 of the Rookie Big Board podcast. I'm your host, Matt Hicks, the FF Educator, and after a couple weeks off, I am back at it. So excited to be back in front of the mic talking rookies again with you. We're going to be digging in on this episode into some projections, some real translation here for the 2021 rookie class. We're going to start here with JaMarr Chase. This is a guy I've been getting a lot of questions on, despite the fact that JaMarr Chase was the first wide receiver off the board, despite the fact that he has a fantastic rookie profile. There's still a lot of questions with how exactly he fits in with the Cincinnati Bengals offense. So that's what I'm going to do on this episode. I'm going to break down not only how JaMarr Chase fits into the Cincinnati Bengals offense, I'm also going to find some recent comparisons in terms of rookie wide receiver productions that we could try to draw for JaMarr Chase. And I'm also going to talk about my overall expectations for the Cincinnati Bengals offense. And we're going to do a little recapping and review of JaMarr Chase's rookie profile. And let's go ahead and start right there. For folks who might not be as familiar with JaMarr Chase, maybe you're just tuning into rookies now, maybe you just need a little bit of a refresher. JaMarr Chase really was the headliner of this class. Remember, Chase opted out of the 2020 college football season, but he didn't need to play. In 2019, he led the entire country in receiving 1,780 yards, 20 touchdowns, 21.2 yards per reception, and that was in 14 games, and that's on 84 receptions. He was truly fantastic catching the ball from Joe Burrow, who he's going to catch the ball from, of course, in the NFL as well. Now, in terms of his profile, 6'1", 200, he checks the boxes for size. His strengths are his hands are just absolutely phenomenal. He catches the ball very consistently. His contested catchability is absolutely fantastic. He runs the entire route tree well. He truly does not have a lot of weaknesses. If I had to pinpoint one, it really is his blocking ability. But if you looked at the way LSU utilized him in 2019, they weren't really asking him to run the ball, or to block, I should say, a lot. But he is especially effective running post and comeback routes. He breaks off mean slants for touchdowns at will. He has game-changing acceleration downfield, and he's truly a tremendous athlete. That really feeds into his contested catch monster ability. He'll go up and win nearly every ball thrown. I reference his hands. They're sticky. He's never dropping a catchable ball, and he is bringing in balls thrown off target as well. And of course, I already alluded to this, but he's comfortable catching the ball from Joe Burrow. So that's just a little bit of background here on JaMarr Chase. But let's talk a little bit about now recent rookie wide receiver production and what's actually realistic for us to expect from JaMarr Chase in his first season. And I think being realistic is really important. Now, the immediate spot that your mind goes to when you hear about the first wide receiver off the board, remember, number 5 overall, a high draft pick for Cincinnati, a team that had a plethora of other needs, including offensive line. They chose to invest in JaMarr Chase, and it makes sense that as fantasy players were excited about him going that high. That is significantly high draft capital. So let's look here of some recent production. You go immediately to Justin Jefferson, who just this past season in 2020 absolutely lit up the NFL. 17.1 fantasy points per game. In PPR scoring, Justin Jefferson finished as wide receiver 6 in his first season. Now, that's an outlier. And I'm saying that as somebody who is hyping up Justin Jefferson. If you remember, for those who have been following me for a while, you know I called Justin Jefferson as the wide receiver 1 last season for rookie production, and it was because of his situation. It made so much sense that his talent and his skill set fit in with the volume gap that had been created by Stephon Diggs moving from Minnesota to Buffalo. It was a fairly obvious take for me, but it seemed controversial for a lot of folks. Obviously, that was proved to be correct. Now, I'm not immediately going to say that JaMarr Chase is Justin Jefferson. If you look over the past 3 seasons, 2018 to 2020, Justin Jefferson, for playing an entire 16-game season, that's a pretty significant he's significantly outproduced anybody else who's played a 16-game season. The next highest scorer on a 16-game season is A.J. Brown, who averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game. So that might get you in a little bit more comfortable of a situation. Now, by the way, if you're talking specifically fantasy points per game, Brandon Ayuk had 15.4 in 2020, and Terry McLaurin had 13.7. So both of those guys did have more fantasy points per game than A.J. Brown, who I just listed off, but Ayuk played 12 games, Terry McLaurin played 14 games. Now, let's go back to A.J. Brown. He falls into a different situation than necessarily JaMarr Chase does. So I don't want to draw an exact comparison because A.J. Brown, similar to Justin Jefferson, benefited from not having significant volume to compete with. So the way Justin Jefferson was really just competing with Adam Thielen in an offense that really just featured two wide receivers and a tight end, that was a very similar situation for A.J. Brown, who in 2019 was featured in an offense that really had Corey Davis. And remember, Corey Davis really wasn't that fantastic even in 2019, and Jonnu Smith wasn't even that fantastic really in 2019. But despite that, A.J. Brown was able to put up 13.6. It was on 52 receptions, and it was on 1,051 yards, averaging 20.2 yards per reception and 8 touchdowns. The 8 touchdowns was really huge for A.J. Brown. It helped push him over the top. That's more touchdowns than Justin Jefferson got in his 7 last year. And it helped A.J. Brown end up finishing that season as the wide receiver 18. So I just mentioned the two highest scoring guys. That's a big gap. You know, wide receiver 6 for Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 18 for A.J. Brown. I'm going to allude a little bit here. JaMarr Chase is going to end up for me falling in between those two guys. But I want to talk a little bit about Calvin Ridley, because Calvin Ridley might be a better comparison here to directly draw to JaMarr Chase, just in terms of offensive fit. Now, the thing that makes both the Vikings and the Titans, the two teams I've talked about earlier, different than the Bengals, is that the Falcons throw the ball a lot. They're going to throw the ball 600 plus times on average in a season. That helped Calvin Ridley in 2018 average 12.9 fantasy points per game, 64 receptions, 821 yards, and Calvin Ridley had 10 receiving touchdowns as a rookie. He leads all rookie wide receivers over the past 3 seasons in scoring touchdowns from rookie wide receivers. So that was how Calvin Ridley, he benefited not only from a high volume offense, but from a high scoring offense, especially in 2018 when you look at that Atlanta Falcons team. Now, we're going to actually talk about JaMarr Chase specifically in the Cincinnati Bengals offense. And one of the things that you're going to find that I'm going to really hone in on is that 600 plus attempts mark. JaMarr Chase is going to find himself in an offense throwing the ball 600 plus times, just like Calvin Ridley did. And Calvin Ridley, like I mentioned, 12.9 fantasy points per game. So that's a number to keep in mind here when we're talking about these two prospects. Now, when you look at their profiles coming out, I'm going to have a better score and a better evaluation for JaMarr Chase than I necessarily do Calvin Ridley. Now, I just talked about the Bengals offense, so let's talk about the guy who played as a rookie wide receiver in the Bengals offense last season, and that's T. Higgins. Now, remember, and this is going to be an important point when we're breaking down the Bengals offense, the Bengals offense in 2020 is not the exact same offense as we're going to see in 2021 because, of course, Joe Burrow missed a significant portion of the season. Now, despite that, T. Higgins averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game over 14 games. He caught 67 of his 108 targets, and he still brought in 908 yards and 6 touchdowns. Now, remember who was throwing the ball. A rotation of backup quarterbacks there once Joe Burrow went down. But T. Higgins, he really clicked early on with Joe Burrow. And although his touchdowns not as high as maybe Calvin Ridley with 10, 6 touchdowns for a rookie wide receiver is really fantastic. And 900 yards. That's awesome for T. Higgins. Now remember, T. Higgins was taken with the Bengals' first pick in the 2nd round last year. JaMarr Chase, first wide receiver off the board, a top 5 pick. I love T. Higgins coming out. He was my wide receiver 3 in last year's class. That was higher than most. It ended up looking like a pretty good spot to be in. And I think you're still pretty happy if you're a T. Higgins manager, but you're definitely happy if you're a JaMarr Chase manager as well. So that's playing in as close to the same offense as we can get. If you look at the sample size that T. Higgins played with Joe Burrow, it was really electric. It was really fantastic there in Cincinnati. And then I do feel the need to at least mention here that even highly drafted guys like Jerry Jeudy, they could find themselves in a challenging situation. So I just always like to show both ends of the spectrum. Now, Jerry Jeudy ends up falling into an offense who, similar to Cincinnati, had a rotation of quarterbacks coming in after the starter went down. Of course, Drew Lock, not as good of a starting quarterback as Joe Burrow, so even the ideal healthy starter was not as fantastic. But Jerry Jeudy last year in 2020, despite being the 15th pick off the board, second wide receiver, for most folks, he was the wide receiver 1 for them pre-draft. I actually had CeeDee Lamb higher. CeeDee Lamb ended up outscoring Jerry Jeudy, despite the fact that his starting quarterback actually went down as well. But nonetheless, a lot of folks had Jerry Jeudy 1 or 2, and Jerry Jeudy ends up with 9.8 fantasy points per game, 52 receptions on 113 targets. That was the key for a lot of folks. And I know he had inaccurate quarterback play, and I do expect Jerry Jeudy to improve, and I do actually have Jerry Jeudy as a big buy right now. He only caught 53% of his passes, which is not what we expected. He did have 850 yards and just 3 touchdowns. The touchdowns really held back Jerry Jeudy from being a significant fantasy player. And again, I do think he's going to improve this year, especially with Courtland Sutton coming back, opening up the field. And who knows, hopefully we get some more consistent gunslinger play out of Drew Lock and maybe a little bit more volume overall in the passing game there in Denver. Now, back to Joe Burrow specifically here. Or I should say back to the 2020 Bengals specifically here. Joe Burrow really had the T. Higgins and the Tyler Boyd show in 2020. If you look at these two guys, T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd, Higgins, 108 targets, 67 receptions. He caught 62% of his passes, 908 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Now, again, that's not just Joe Burrow. That's a lot of Joe Burrow in there. All right, Tyler Boyd, 110 targets, 79 receptions. So Tyler Boyd caught 72% of his receptions, which is really fantastic. 841 yards, 4 touchdowns. So you could see, even though Tyler Boyd really started off as the guy earlier in the season and T. Higgins kind of gained steam by the end of the season, T. Higgins is clearly the touchdown guy. And I think Tyler Boyd is going to get left behind in terms of touchdowns. Now, it's important to also point out that A.J. Green was on the field for Cincinnati last year. He caught 47 balls. He caught 2 touchdowns, 523 yards. Of course, he could not stay healthy, but he was healthy at the beginning of the season, kind of trailed off there. 194 fantasy points in PPR for T. Higgins. That was 12.2. Tyler Boyd had 12.8. A.J. Brown had just 7. That's kind of what the passing offense looked like. In terms of just raw statistics from Joe Burrow, he completed 65% of 404 passing attempts. Now, he played in 10 games, and he threw the ball 404 times. That is a very high number. And if you look at actual game splits, remember, there were multiple games where Joe Burrow threw the ball 35 plus times in a game. It seems pretty clear to me that Cincinnati wants Joe Burrow to throw the ball a ton. And clearly he's throwing the ball to his wide receivers. I'm going to get into that a little bit more here. You look at his touchdown-interception ratio, 13-5. 13 touchdowns in 10 games does not sound fantastic, but historically, rookie quarterbacks, they just don't throw that many touchdowns, especially when you consider the offense that Joe Burrow was playing in. It wasn't one that was able to, really protect him, keep him upright, and allow him to consistently be pushing the ball downfield. He also didn't really have a running game supporting him last year because of the injuries and inconsistencies with Joe Mixon. So Cincinnati wasn't pushing the ball into the red zone as much, but he was clearly protecting the ball, which you'd like to see. His overall QB rating was an 89.8, which again, for a rookie quarterback, that's not too bad at all. So what I want to actually do now is flip into my projections here and talk specifically about how I have this team slated to perform in the 2021 season. So first and foremost, potentially most importantly here, they threw the ball 581 times last season. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to project Cincinnati to throw the ball 625 times this season. That's an increase of 44 passing attempts, but remember, Joe Burrow missed the last 6 games of the season. And by the way, my projections right now are all based on 16 games. I know they're playing 17 games this season, but for me to better draw comparisons across years, my projections are in 16 games. And for the patrons who subscribe to the $6 level, patreon.com/theFFeducator, they get my full rankings. And in just about August, I'll flip it over to the 17-game model. Remember, we really should be looking at fantasy points per game, so it's not a huge difference here. But anyways, under a 16-game model, I expect Joe Burrow to throw the ball 625 times over the course of the season. So that's going to bump him up here. That's going to bump up the entire offense. And I have him at just 22 passing touchdowns. I'm trying to be conservative here. 22 passing touchdowns for somebody who flashed in the way Joe Burrow did this past season. That's conservative. And I want to point that out, that I'm projecting this offense in a conservative way, because if we talk about how JaMarr Chase is fitting in, I really want to point out that when you see the final ranking, I think you're going to be excited if you're a JaMarr Chase manager, but also I'm being conservative with the way I'm proceeding. I'm also trying to be conservative with Joe Burrow's rehab and recovery for his knee injury that, of course, ended the season. That's why he missed the extra games. But, all reports, all indications are that he's going to come back healthy. But again, I like to project conservatively. So, when you look at how I have the wide receiver split out, I have Tyler Boyd still leading the team in market share here. 22% of the receiving market share for Tyler Boyd. That is 137 targets. They're going to throw the ball a lot. 137 targets for Tyler Boyd. And I don't think T. Higgins is going anywhere. All right, I have 131 targets for T. Higgins, 21% of the market share. And then I have JaMarr Chase there at 20% of the market share. 125 targets. So, I just told you that I have JaMarr Chase with the fewest amount of targets between Boyd, Higgins, and Chase. There's room for 3 guys on this offense. Because if you're third on your team and you have 125 targets, you are still in a really, really good spot. Now, JaMarr Chase, I think in a lot of ways, he's going to split the best of both worlds between what the Bengals have been getting from T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd. I mentioned JaMarr Chase's hands. He's consistent. He's catching everything. And he's going to do it stretching the field. So he brings a little bit of that high possession reliability that they've been getting from Tyler Boyd. I have him catching 68% of his balls. I have Tyler Boyd catching 70% of his balls. But JaMarr Chase, of course, can stretch the field a little bit further than Tyler Boyd can, a little bit more in the way that T. Higgins was stretching the field on that offense last year. So I have JaMarr Chase at 13 yards per reception, where I have Tyler Boyd at 11, and I have T. Higgins at 13.5. Now, the key, touchdowns. That's going to be the biggest wild card here with the Cincinnati Bengals offense. I have JaMarr Chase right now catching 6 touchdowns. That feels safe. I just mentioned Calvin Ridley caught 10. Justin Jefferson caught 7. So it's 100% in the realm of possibility here that JaMarr Chase ends up catching more than 6, but 6 feels good, and it also I have him leading the team with those 6. I have T. Higgins at 5, Tyler Boyd at 4, C.J. Uzomah with 2, I have Auden Tate with 2, I have Joe Mixon with 2, so I think it's going to be spread out a decent amount. Now, I just mentioned Joe Mixon, and I want to reference that. Joe Mixon is not necessarily a high-volume pass-catching back. I have him at 50 targets, 8% of the market share. To be honest, that feels a little generous, because I think he's going to be mostly used to run the ball. I think they're going to run Mixon to the ground here over the final years of his extended contract, and then I think they're going to move on from him, right? But I think they're going to get the use of him on the ground while he's healthy, if he can stay healthy, and so I don't think they're going to add extra usage on him significantly in the passing game. Now, 50 targets is nothing to shake your head at. If you're a Joe Mixon truther, I am at 13.4 fantasy points per game. It's nothing bad here. But look at the tight ends. The Bengals don't utilize their tight ends. They showed no interest in adding more tight ends to their team. I mean, Auden Tate is basically a tight end playing a wide receiver. They didn't heavily utilize Drew Sample. Even though, the C.J. Uzomah crowd is out there, he's flashed at times, but he's not consistently on the field for them. I gave Uzomah and Sample 37.5 targets each, gave them each 6% of the market share. They could split 12% for the tight end side of things. That's totally fine for me. But at the end of the day, the Cincinnati Bengals are throwing the ball 625 times. That is a lot. So what does that equal? For T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd, for both of them, it equals 14.1 fantasy points per game. So the good news is, if you got T. Higgins from last year, remember, you probably used an early second-round rookie pick on him, 14.1 points per game, you're in a good spot. You got Tyler Boyd, you're drafting at value right now. Now, I will say, if anybody is going to drop off from these projections, it's probably going to be Tyler Boyd, but I think there's still a safe floor there. I still have him at 1,058 receiving yards. Now I have JaMarr Chase slightly outproducing these two, 14.5 fantasy points per game. It's 1,100 receiving yards, and it's 6 touchdowns. Now, the 1,100 receiving yards is really high for a rookie wide receiver, but I think he can hit that mark. And remember, the 6 touchdowns is not high. So where does that equal out in the grand scheme of things? In terms of my overall player projections, which again, patreon.com/theFFeducator, available for all patrons, all 32 teams here, broken down individually for each team tab, like I just showed, and also broken down by position. And there's a separate rookie tab too, if you want to just compare rookies. So overall here, This puts JaMarr Chase as wide receiver 14. I mentioned he was going to land between Justin Jefferson as wide receiver 6 and A.J. Brown as wide receiver 18. In PPR formats, JaMarr Chase, wide receiver 14 at 231 fantasy points. That sandwiches him in between Stephon Diggs at 13 and DK Metcalf at 15. And that is a really, really fantastic spot to be in. I'd be very happy with that if I was a JaMarr Chase manager, if I had drafted him as the first wide receiver off the board in rookie drafts. Listen, every league is a little bit different, but he really should be the first wide receiver off the board. I like Jalen Waddle. He's my wide receiver 2. I'm not taking him over JaMarr Chase. It's really easy for me, JaMarr Chase, and he fits into the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Listen, I think they're going to move these guys around a lot. Tyler Boyd, he's probably going to live in the slot. I think we can expect JaMarr Chase to transition into that X role, maybe not the first couple of games, and T. Higgins is probably going to live more in that flanker type capacity, but I think they're going to move these guys all around the field, and that's one of the things that makes JaMarr Chase special. At 6'1", 200, he has the ability to serve in a lot of different capacities here for the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Now, when you look at actual rookies, right, so not just, the value overall for fantasy football, but considering immediate production from the rookie position, if you take quarterbacks out of the equation, I have Najee Harris as the top scoring guy at 247 fantasy points. I'm high on Najee Harris, and I'm going to break that down, I'm sure, in a soon coming episode here, because we are just not high about Najee Harris, but I've been talking about that for 6 months. You all don't need to hear more of that. But then it's JaMarr Chase coming up at 2 with 231 fantasy points. And just for comparison here, my next highest scoring rookie is Jalen Waddle, who I'm bullish on relative to most, and that's at 212 fantasy points. So a decent drop-off here between my wide receiver 1 and my wide receiver 2. And overall, that here is what I'm expecting from JaMarr Chase, and that is how I see JaMarr Chase really kind of fitting in to the Cincinnati Bengals offense. I appreciate you checking out this episode. We're going to try to dig more into actual projections and production here as the summer goes on. We're also going to start talking about the 2022 class. It's time to start building that board, get some summer scouting reports in. So we're going to be doing that here on the Rookie Big Board as well. If you're not already subscribed, whether you're watching, whether you're listening, please make sure you do that. And if you want to get more content, access to my Dynasty rankings, my Devy rankings, my 2022 big board as I begin to build that out here over the next couple weeks, or access to the 2021 rookie big board, you can get in on it $3, $6, $9. Heck, there's a tier at $1, patreon.com/theFFeducator.